Hello and welcome. This is Daniel Topf teaching about David Bosch's Theology of Mission as part of our Intercultural Studies course here in week 9. So as we'll see in the moment, there's a reason why we're focusing on David Bosch when we want to understand God's mission and theology of mission, which is the topic for this week 9. So here in this overview, I'm going to explain that I first want to highlight the significance of David Bosch's book, Transforming Mission, Paradigm Shifts in Theology of Mission. So it's a book that was first published in 1991. And as you can see in the subtitle, Paradigm Shifts in Theology of Mission, it directly relates to one of our key themes for this week, which is to have a theology of mission that informs our intercultural engagements. And so Bosch's book is very important. It's also very long. In the 2011 edition, it's over 600 pages. And I hope someday you'll find the time to read it in its entirety. But for now, I want to give you an overview. And so I'm starting it with part 1, as Bosch divided his book into several parts, which is typical for missiologies that often are a combination between theological, historical, and practical matters. So for Bosch, in his part 1, he starts with theology. More specifically, he starts with New Testament models of mission, highlighting that different authors in the New Testament had a different approach to mission. And then in part 2, he goes into history, into church history, and he describes historical paradigms of mission, showing how over time the church, not a specific denomination, but the church in general over the last 2,000 years has had a different understanding of what mission means and how it should be approached. And then in part 3, he has what he calls the going toward a relevant missiology for today, for the postmodern age that we live in. So that's more like the application of all that he has explained before. So David Bosch's Transforming Mission will be our theme for this video and also the following one. And I want to start by explaining, 1, why this book is important, and then 2, what it tells us about the Missio Dei, considering that the Missio Dei, or the mission of God, is one of our main themes here in week 9. So first to the point, why Bosch's book is important. So there's of course there are different ways of how we can identify whether a book is particularly important, but one of the ways is to identify what other people have said about it. And so we find here 3 examples of praise for transforming mission, the kind of praise that's often found on the back cover of a book. So one is from Christianity Today, the well-known magazine within the evangelical world, and they say that David Bosch's Transforming Mission is one of the 100 most significant books of the 20th century. And then we have Leslie Newbigin here, and Newbigin was himself a famous missiologist, a minister from the UK who went to India to minister there for many years. And he said David Bosch's work is a kind of summa missiologica. And with that, of course, with the Latin word summa, he's referring to the famous Summa that Thomas Aquinas wrote in the Middle Ages, in which he tried to summarize all of theology. And so Newbigin is saying that Bosch has done something similar in the discipline of missiology. And he goes on to say, it will surely be the indispensable foundation for the teaching of missiology for many years to come. And that has proven to be true. I think David Bosch's work is still unsurpassed and is still a work that is being used to teach missiology, as I'm also doing here with you in this course. And then we have a quote from William Burroughs, who in the preface to the 20th anniversary edition writes, in the years since 1991, when David Bosch's long-awaited masterpiece Transforming Mission was first published, it has achieved such wide recognition that adjectives such as classic and magisterial have been applied to it. So when we are looking at the transformation, the book, and our topic of the Missio Dei, what we'll find is that Bosch's work helps us to recognize God as the main actor in missions, enabling us to approach the task given to us with humility or bold humility. So this is one of the main teaching goals that I have for this week, is to highlight an approach to mission where we make a shift from a more human-centered view of mission toward a more God-centered view of mission. And that puts us as humans in the right place, in the place of humility, acknowledging that ultimately it is only God who can accomplish his purposes on earth and his plans for humanity. At the same time, bold humility is one of the famous phrases of Bosch. And so, because his idea was that, yes, we need to have a posture of humility, but at the same time, because God has entrusted to us the gospel of salvation, we can also proclaim it with boldness, even in the face of adversity or indifference. Back to our overview. So we talked a little bit about the significance of David Bosch's book, Transforming Mission. And now I want to give you an overview of the part 1 of this book, which are the New Testament models of mission that Bosch describes there. And so part 1, New Testament models of mission, what Bosch is saying there first, he makes the statement that the New Testament in general, all the different parts of the New Testament, the Gospels, Acts, the epistles, can be understood as a collection of missionary documents. And then he gives us 3 examples in which he says, okay, for Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, there the approach to mission is primarily mission as disciple making, which is different from Luke Acts, where the focus is on practicing forgiveness and solidarity with the poor. And then he also highlights how Paul understands mission, where mission is an invitation to join the eschatological community. So for the first point, that we can understand that New Testament is a missionary document, there Bosch communicates his conviction that mission is the mother of theology, which is different from what many theologians have said throughout church history, where theology seemed to be primary and then mission or missiology or some form of practical theology was just a subtopic within that. But what Bosch is saying is that the New Testament writers were not scholars who had the leisure to research the evidence before they put pen to paper. Rather, they wrote in the context of an emergency situation of a church which, because of its missionary encounter with the world, was forced to theologize. So that's Bosch's encouragement to us to understand the New Testament writers as practitioners who had something practical in mind when they wrote theology. And so while Bosch is saying that this is true of the entire New Testament, with another scholar, Christopher Wright, you will find in the reading that's also included for this week, he applies that to the entire Bible, specifically to the Old Testament. And so Wright would say that the entire Bible, including and especially the Old Testament, is also a missionary document. And part of that is simply the background of these scholars, because Wright was trained as an Old Testament scholar while Bosch was trained as a New Testament scholar. And so that's the focus he is giving us here. So starting with Matthew as the first example, he says in Matthew, mission is understood as disciple making or as missionary discipleship. And he writes, Matthew assures us that on the basis of the earthly ministry, the death and the resurrection of Jesus, the road of mission to the Gentiles is open. The disciples are called to proclaim Jesus' ultimate victory over the power of evil, to witness to his abiding presence, and to lead the world toward the recognition of the love of God. So in the Gospel of Matthew, we have, of course, an emphasis on teaching, right? Jesus as a teacher, Jesus calling different people to become his disciples, and then also formulating the expectations toward discipleship and setting his own example as he went to the cross, a road of suffering that his discipleship may also have to travel, his disciples may also have to travel. And then, of course, in Matthew 28, we have like the summary or the climax of the gospel when Jesus tells his disciples to now make disciples of all nations. So that's what we gain in Matthew. And then in Luke Acts, we have a different approach. And that's really part of what Bosch wants to show us here, that mission is not only one thing, or that there's not only one way to understand mission or to approach missions. There's different ways to do that. And so there's a certain complexity to mission that is already ingrained in the diversity of authors that we find in the New Testament. So in Luke Acts, we have the focus of mission as practicing forgiveness and solidarity with the poor. And there he says, one could say that for Luke, salvation actually had 6 dimensions: economic, social, political, physical, psychological, and spiritual. Luke seemed to pay special attention to the first of these, which means dimensions of salvation that are economic, social, political, while we as evangelicals and Pentecostals, I guess it's fair to say, we often have focused on the more personal and spiritual aspect of salvation. So here Bosch goes on to say, we may thus detect a major element in Luke's missionary paradigm in what he writes about the new relationship between the rich and the poor. There are at this point parallels between Matthew and Luke. The difference is that whereas Matthew emphasized justice in general, Luke seemed to have a peculiar interest in economic justice. And that's something you can study on your own. If you study the Gospel of Luke and then compare it to Matthew or also Mark, you will find that there is a greater emphasis in Luke on marginalized groups in society. And that would be a fascinating study that could then also inform your own approach to missions and to your ministry. And so then after Matthew and Luke Acts, the next example that Bosch gives us is mission at Paul, which is understood as an invitation to join the eschatological community. And so Bosch writes, the church is the vanguard of the new creation and has of necessity to reflect the values of God's coming world. In light of this, any form of segregation in the church, whether racial, ethnic, social, or whatever, is in Paul's understanding a denial of the gospel. Reconciliation and justification manifest themselves in interdependence in Philadelphia, meaning brotherly love between believers. The members of the new community find their identity in Jesus Christ rather than in their race, culture, social class, or sex. And so what Bosch is highlighting here is that for Paul, the church is a community of believers who live in the light of eternity, in the light of the second coming, of the full consummation of God's kingdom that still lies in the future. However, that hope and vision for the future has to inform in very practical ways how they live here on earth and in the present, specifically on how they relate to other people, and in particular to people who are different from themselves. And there's a special significance here for Bosch, of course, to highlight this, because Bosch was actually from South Africa, and so he lived in South Africa when it was still an apartheid state. And so in writing like these, he is, of course, challenging that unjust practice. So that was our overview here of part 1, New Testament models of mission. Next will be our part 2, historical paradigms of mission. And I'm going to do that in the following video because I want to keep the videos below 15 minutes. So thank you for your attention, and I see you at the next video.